August 2024, 3 in the morning. The city of Moscow, a metropolis of 12 million people, located over 800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, sleeps uneasily. Then, without warning, the night sky erupts in fire. A Ukrainian drone, launched from a basement workshop somewhere in Kyiv, has just struck a high-rise apartment building in the Russian capital. Not a military target, not a strategic installation, a message. This is the unseen war. A conflict fought not on the front lines of Bakhmut or Mariupol, but in the shadows of computer screens, in the workshops of engineers, and in the flight paths of machines that carry no pilots, only payloads. Welcome to Ukraine's covert drone campaign deep inside Russia. This is the story of how a nation turned its desperation into innovation, and how the rules of modern warfare were rewritten in the process. When Russian forces crossed the Ukrainian border on February 24, 2022, the world expected a swift victory. Russia possessed the world's second-largest military, thousands of tanks, advanced fighter jets, and a nuclear arsenal. Ukraine, by comparison, had a fraction of those resources. But what Ukraine lacked in firepower, it made up for in ingenuity. Within weeks of the invasion, Ukrainian forces began experimenting with commercial drones, quadcopters bought from online retailers, modified in garages and basements. These weren't military-grade systems. They were hobbyist equipment, repurposed for war. Duct tape, 3D printed parts, jury-rigged guidance systems. At first, they were used for reconnaissance, then for dropping grenades on Russian positions. But Ukrainian engineers saw something more, a way to strike back, not just at the soldiers on their soil, but at the heart of Russian territory itself. By late 2022, reports began emerging of mysterious explosions deep inside Russia. An airfield in Saratov, over 500 kilometers from Ukraine. An oil depot in Bryansk. A military base near Moscow. Russian officials blamed sabotage, technical malfunctions, cigarettes carelessly discarded near fuel tanks. But intelligence analysts knew better. Ukraine had developed long-range strike drones, and they were hunting targets far beyond the battlefield. The drone program didn't start in a defense ministry conference room. It started in civilian workshops. Engineers who once designed agricultural drones or racing quadcopters suddenly found themselves building weapons of war. These weren't professional weapons manufacturers. They were software developers, hobbyists, university professors, and mechanics. People who had never held a military rank, but understood aerodynamics, electronics, and the art of making something from nothing. In the early days, they worked without contracts, without official recognition, driven purely by the knowledge that their country's survival depended on innovation. One engineer described the early prototypes as flying experiments held together by hope. They crashed, they malfunctioned, they fell from the sky miles short of their targets. But each failure taught them something. How to extend battery life, how to reduce radar signature, how to program autonomous navigation that could operate even when GPS signals were jammed. The workshops themselves became targets. Russia knew that disrupting Ukraine's drone production was critical. Missile strikes hit suspected manufacturing sites. Intelligence operatives tried to infiltrate the networks. But the distributed nature of the program made it resilient. One workshop might build engines, another assembled guidance systems, a third handled final integration. No single strike could cripple the entire operation. The key innovation wasn't in raw technology, it was in adaptation. Ukraine took what was available and made it lethal. Commercial GPS systems, encrypted communication links, fiberglass airframes that could evade radar. And most importantly, a distributed production network that made the program nearly impossible to disrupt. If Russia bombed one workshop, 5 more were already operational. If they intercepted one drone design, 10 variants were being tested. This wasn't a centralized military program. It was a decentralized insurgency of engineers. The targets were chosen with surgical precision. Ukraine's intelligence services, working closely with Western partners, identified critical nodes in Russia's military infrastructure. Not just air bases and ammunition depots, but oil refineries that fueled the war machine. Defense factories producing missiles and artillery shells. Command and control centers coordinating operations in occupied territories. Each strike required meticulous planning. Flight paths calculated to avoid radar coverage. Launch windows timed to weather patterns and air defense schedules. Payloads optimized for maximum psychological and material impact. And then came the missions themselves. Picture this: a moonless night in the Ukrainian countryside. A team of operators, faces hidden, identities classified, prepares a drone for launch. It's larger than the quadcopters you see on the front lines. Fixed wing, nearly 3 meters long, painted matte black to absorb radar. The engine starts with a high-pitched whine. Within seconds, it's airborne, climbing into the darkness. The operators watch on screens as GPS coordinates guide the machine north, toward Russia. For the next several hours, the drone flies autonomously. It crosses forests and farmland, staying low to avoid radar detection. Russian air defenses, designed to track supersonic jets and ballistic missiles, struggle to identify such a small, slow-moving target. Inside the drone's simple computer brain, a targeting algorithm processes real-time data: wind speed, air density, distance to target. The margin for error is 0. One miscalculation and the mission fails. Then, impact. On December 5, 2023, Ukrainian drones struck the Diaghilevo Air Base near Ryazan, over 400 kilometers inside Russia. Satellite imagery later confirmed damage to several strategic bombers, 2 95 and 2 160 aircraft, each worth hundreds of millions of dollars. These were the same planes that had been launching cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities. The message was clear: if you strike our homes, we will strike yours. But the campaign went beyond military targets. In January 2024, drones hit oil refineries in Tuapse and Novorossiysk, disrupting fuel supplies for Russian forces. In March, they struck defense factories in Tatarstan and Udmurtia, regions that most Russians believed were untouchable, far from the war's reach. Each successful strike expanded the psychological battlefield. Russian civilians, once insulated from the war, now lived with the same uncertainty as Ukrainians. Air raid sirens in Moscow, evacuations in St. Petersburg. The Kremlin's promise of a safe, victorious war was crumbling, and Ukraine's drones kept evolving. By mid-2024, Ukrainian engineers had developed drones capable of flying over 1,000 kilometers. Some used AI-assisted navigation to avoid electronic warfare countermeasures. Others carried explosive payloads designed to penetrate reinforced bunkers. A few were equipped with thermal imaging, allowing them to hunt targets even in total darkness. Russian air defenses scrambled to adapt. They deployed additional radar systems, increased patrols of border regions, and even experimented with electronic jamming networks. But for every countermeasure Russia developed, Ukraine found a workaround. This became a high-stakes technological arms race. Russia possessed more resources, but Ukraine had desperation, and desperation breeds innovation faster than bureaucracy ever could. Intelligence sources report that some Ukrainian drones are now built with parts sourced from a dozen different countries: a German engine, Chinese electronics, Polish composite materials, American guidance chips, all assembled in Ukraine, launched from hidden sites and operated by teams who know that a single mistake could mean death, not just for them, but for the mission and the soldiers depending on it. But here's what makes this campaign truly unprecedented: its strategic ambiguity. Ukraine rarely claims responsibility for specific strikes. They'll hint, they'll smile when asked, but official confirmation, almost never. This maintains plausible deniability while still achieving the psychological effect. Russia knows who's responsible, but they can't retaliate without escalating the conflict in ways that might draw NATO deeper into the war. It's a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, using an adversary's strengths against them. Russia's size, once an advantage, became a vulnerability. Their vast territory meant endless targets and stretched defenses. Their centralized military infrastructure made high-value targets easy to identify. And Ukraine, despite being the smaller power, dictated the terms of this shadow war. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect wasn't the technology itself. It was the people behind it. The operators who launched these missions understood the weight of their actions. They weren't pressing buttons in a video game. Every target represented a choice. Every launch carried consequences. Some nights they sat in silence after a successful strike, knowing they had just destroyed millions of dollars in military equipment, but also knowing that Russian forces would retaliate somewhere, somehow. There were close calls, drones that were nearly intercepted, saved only by last-second course corrections. Operators who had to abort missions when civilian vehicles appeared near military targets. Intelligence that proved incorrect, sending drones to empty buildings or abandoned facilities. The program's success rate was never perfect, but it didn't need to be. Every drone that reached its target was a victory. Every mission that forced Russia to divert resources was a strategic win, and the psychological impact extended beyond Russia's borders. Military analysts worldwide watched in fascination as Ukraine demonstrated that modern warfare had fundamentally changed. No longer did you need stealth bombers worth billions or carrier battle groups to project power deep into enemy territory. You needed ingenuity, determination, and a willingness to adapt faster than your opponent could respond. The lessons weren't lost on other nations facing larger adversaries. Taiwan studied Ukraine's drone tactics. Baltic states incorporated similar strategies into their defense planning. Even major military powers began reassessing their vulnerability to small, cheap, distributed drone swarms. Ukraine hadn't just changed one war, they had changed warfare itself. By October 2024, Ukrainian drone strikes had hit over 200 targets inside Russia. The cumulative effect was staggering, not just in material damage, but in morale. Russian military production slowed, oil exports decreased, air defense systems were pulled from the front lines to protect strategic rear areas, giving Ukrainian forces more freedom to operate. And perhaps most significantly, the Russian public's confidence in their government's control eroded. For Ukraine, the drone campaign achieved multiple objectives simultaneously. It disrupted Russian logistics, it diverted resources away from offensive operations, it demonstrated to Western partners that Ukraine could innovate and adapt, making continued support a sound investment, and it showed the Ukrainian people that they could strike back, that they weren't helpless victims. But this shadow war came with costs. Every strike risked escalation. Every drone that hit a civilian area, intentionally or through malfunction, complicated Ukraine's moral position. The line between legitimate military target and terrorism blurred in the minds of international observers, and the technological genie, once released, couldn't be put back in the bottle. If Ukraine could build long-range strike drones from commercial components, so could any nation, insurgent group, or terrorist organization. The precedent was set. Still, for Ukraine, the calculation was simple: adapt or perish. The drone campaign wasn't about glory or conquest. It was about survival, about making the cost of war too high for Russia to sustain, about proving that borders mean nothing when your enemy refuses to respect them. War has always been a contest of wills as much as weapons. Ukraine's covert drone campaign inside Russia won't be found in traditional military textbooks. There are no grand tank battles here, no carrier strike groups or strategic bomber raids. Instead, there are engineers working by candlelight during power outages, operators guiding machines through hostile airspace with nothing but GPS coordinates and hope, intelligence analysts identifying targets that will make the enemy think twice before launching the next missile at Kyiv or Kharkiv. This is 21st century warfare, asymmetric, technological, and relentless, where a nation under siege can strike back at an adversary 800 kilometers away, using machines built in basements and launched from fields. The unseen war continues. Every night, drones lift off from hidden sites across Ukraine. Some will hit their targets, others will be intercepted or malfunction, but the message remains constant. We are here, we are fighting, and your borders will not protect you. This is the story of Ukraine's shadow war, a war fought not for territory but for survival, not with armies of millions, but with ingenuity, courage, and a refusal to surrender. And it's far from over.